In the previous section, we have seen what is a class component and how do we take state in a class component. So now we know what is a class-based component. A class component has another important feature called component lifecycle methods. We have already seen one lifecycle method called render, which is the only essential method in a class component. And we saw that we did not call render method. It was automatically called by React. Let's check with a previous example. Here I am adding console log and I'll display a message called rendered. I'll open the console as well here. Let me just refresh so that we begin with the fresh component execution. Now you see that there is a rendered method executed. Not only this, if I click on this button, that is increment, you see that it displays render again. That means when the component was loaded, at that time render was executed, and whenever there is an update in the component, then also the render is getting executed. In fact, render is responsible for making these changes because it is rendering the content. It means that when the component is loading, then there is a mounting phase, and when there is an update happening, the render is happening. That we call as updating phase. React gives you various lifecycle methods divided into various phases, which we will see in a moment. So like this, there are various other methods which you may want to execute at different phases of the component. Now let's take one more lifecycle method named component did mount. So I'm going to add that method here. I'll say component did mount, and here I'm going to use the same statement but with a different message. That is, instead of rendered, I'll say component did mount. So I'll just say CDM. Now the moment I updated this, you see there is a CDM happening. Let me just refresh so that we see the fresh execution. Here, first time when there was the mounting phase of component, that is when the component was loaded, it executed the rendered message, that is this one. And then after that, it did execute component did mount. Did I call this method anywhere? Absolutely no. It is getting called automatically because React takes care of these methods. It's like a constructor in a class which is executed automatically. You don't call a constructor. When you instantiate the object, the constructor is called. In fact, constructor itself is one of the component lifecycle method. So let's say you want to execute some code which is at the initialization phase of the component, then you write a constructor here and write the code inside the constructor. Anyway, so this component did mount, as the name says, it is executed once the component's entry is made in the DOM tree. And we have practically seen here that CDM is executed. This means at this point, after the component is added to the DOM tree, this component did mount is executed. Now if I click on this increment, you would see that only the rendered message is getting executed and not the CDM. The reason is CDM is executed only once the component is mounted, that is, it is added in the DOM tree. Now every time I click on increment, it is not adding it in the DOM tree. It is already there. That's why it is only executed once. Generally, we see that when we have to make calls to API endpoints, that is, we want to make an AJAX call, HTTP call, we write that code in component did mount also. Now like this component did mount, there is one more unmounting phase method called component will unmount. So let me just write here, I'll say component will unmount. Now see, if I'm using Visual Studio Code, then I will have to have a separate component which I have to unload. When the component is removed from the DOM tree, the component will unmount will be executed. But fortunately, I'm using sandbox here, which will help me to execute this method directly, because when I make changes, it unmounts and reloads the component here. So let me just say unmount here. Now I'm refreshing the screen here. Now see this. I make some change to this. So it unmounts and resets the component. That's why we are able to see in Sandbox. But assume that you are writing this code in Visual Studio Code. Then certainly while you remove the component, you will see this component will unmount method called. Now here you see that we have the render method which is executed in the mounting phase and update phase. We have component did mount which is executed in the mounting phase, and component will unmount which is executed in unmounting, that is when the component is getting removed. At that phase, if you want to write some code, you write inside this component will unmount. So when I say phase, the official React document also mentions this. The official document says that these are the common phases of a component like mounting, updating, unmounting, and error handling. So whenever there is a mounting phase, these are the methods. When you have updating phase, you have these methods. In unmounting, you have this method. And while error, there is one more method which you have. Not all the methods are in use, and gradually React also trying to reduce these methods into lesser component life cycles. When it comes to functional component, the approach will be absolutely different. Now as you see in the list, there is one more method. So let's take updating phase method called should component update. If this method is placed and does not return true, it will stop re-rendering. That means the render will not be called when it is getting updated. So if I say, for example, let me just click here, then every time you see that there is rendered message getting executed. Now I'll just say should component update, and inside this I just return false. Though there might be conditions, but I return false. Now when I click here, you see the rendered is not executed, but anyway you can make out because the value is not getting updated. So if you return true here, now there can be a conditional return true or false depending on comparing the state. So normally we have an assumption that should component update is used for performance improvisation, but that is not the case. This method is not used for performance optimization, as there is a class called pure component provided by React, which we will see in detail in forthcoming sections. So for this section, this is just a hint of lifecycle methods. As we move on, you will get to know more aspects of the lifecycle methods and different practical examples as well. Now let's talk about the relative questions. So the first question is, what is the component lifecycle method in a class component? So when you have a class component, there are various phases where the component lifecycle methods are getting executed automatically. For example, we have a constructor, we have render, we have component will mount or should component update kind of methods, and they have a specific execution sequence. So when you have to write some code at a particular sequence, then you use the component lifecycle methods. The second question is, explain phases of lifecycle methods. These are the common phases of a component like mounting, updating, unmounting, and error handling. So whenever there is a mounting phase, these are the methods. When you have updating phase, you have these methods. In unmounting, you have this method. And while error, there is one more method which you have. And the third question is, explain the purpose of lifecycle methods. So the main purpose is, as I mentioned, that there is a specific sequence. Like for example, when the component is mounted, you want to execute something, then you would place that piece of code inside the mounting phase methods. If you want something to initialize, then you generally use the constructor as a lifecycle method. Like we have render method, so whatever needs to be refreshed on the user interface, we put those things inside the render method. So the purpose of lifecycle method is we execute pieces of codes depending on the sequence.